He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and was built like a fortress on skates. He was taken second overall in the entire 1977 draft, not by one league, but by 2. He scored goals like a forward and hit like a freight train. And by every measure that hockey people understand, Barry Beck should have been a New York Rangers cornerstone for 15 years. Instead, he walked away from the National Hockey League at 30. Then he walked away again at 32. A man with that kind of size, that kind of skill, that kind of pedigree, gone, while players half as talented were still grinding out long careers. That is the mystery at the center of this story. Was Barry Beck broken by his own body, a shoulder that kept tearing loose at the worst possible moments? Or was he broken by something heavier and harder to measure? The relentless, suffocating weight of carrying a famous franchise in the most demanding hockey market on the planet. Born June 3rd, 1957, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Beck arrived in New York as a huge name with even bigger expectations. He became the captain of an Original Six club. He played through injuries that would have benched lesser men. And along the way, he became tied to a phrase that Rangers fans still repeat decades later. 4 words that say everything about the gap between what he was and what people demanded he be.
There was a blockbuster trade that shipped a small army of players the other direction. There was a captaincy that may have cost him more than it ever gave. And there was that shoulder, popping and tearing until the strongest part of his game simply vanished. But before he was the man who carried New York's pressure, Barry Beck was a teenager handed off in a trade almost no one remembers, a deal that sent a future famous name the other way. Barry David Beck grew up in Vancouver, British Columbia, a kid in a hockey-mad corner of Canada where the game was less a hobby than a way of life. He was big early, and he was strong early, and those 2 things alone made him impossible for scouts to ignore. In a sport that prizes physical men who can also move the puck, Beck looked like he'd been assembled in a laboratory. His professional journey, though, began with the kind of transaction that tells you exactly how the hockey business treats young players. In the 1973-74 season, Beck appeared in a single game with the Kamloops Chiefs. 1 game. Then, in June of 1974, he was traded, moved to the New Westminster Bruins of the Western League. Here's the detail that makes hockey historians smile. The deal that sent Beck to New Westminster brought a young man named Barry Melrose back to Kamloops the other way. Melrose, of course, would go on to his own long life in the game, as a player, a Stanley Cup final coach, and eventually one of the most recognizable faces in hockey broadcasting. 2 future hockey names swapped as teenagers before either had made anything of himself. It's a small footnote in Beck's story, but it sets a theme that would follow him his entire career. From the very beginning, Barry Beck was a commodity, a player whose value was measured, packaged, and moved by people in offices, often without much warning. He didn't choose Kamloops, and he didn't choose New Westminster. Other men chose for him. In New Westminster, though, the quiet teenager was about to become something genuinely terrifying. A defenseman who could fill the net and fill the penalty box like almost no one before him. The New Westminster Bruins were one of the most feared programs in junior hockey, and Barry Beck fit right into that identity. He wasn't just big, he was productive and dangerous in equal measure, and the numbers from his time there are the kind that make modern scouts blink. In the 1975-76 season, Beck put up 99 points from the blue line. 99. For a defenseman, that's the stat line of an offensive force. But here's the part that completes the picture. That same season, he also racked up a team-high 325 penalty minutes. Read those 2 numbers together,
and you understand exactly what kind of player Barry Beck was becoming. A rare blend of skill and brute force. A man who could beat you on the scoreboard and beat you up along the boards in the same shift. That season wasn't a fluke either. He was named to the Western League's first All-Star team in both 1976 and 1977. Back-to-back elite recognition that confirmed he was one of the very best young defensemen in the country. And then came the crown jewel. In 1977, Beck helped lead New Westminster to the Memorial Cup, the championship of Canadian junior hockey, the trophy every young player dreams about. He didn't just go along for the ride either. He was named the tournament's most valuable player, taking home the Stafford Smythe Memorial Trophy as the best player on the biggest junior stage there is. A champion, a tournament MVP, a scoring defenseman with a mean streak. By the spring of 1977, Barry Beck was no longer a secret. 2 leagues wanted him so badly that both made him the second pick in the entire country, and the choice he made next would set the trajectory of his whole life. In the late 1970s, hockey was a house divided. The established National Hockey League and the upstart World Hockey Association were locked in a war for talent, throwing money and contracts at the best young players to lure them one way or the other. For a prospect like Barry Beck, that war created a rare and flattering situation. In 1977, Beck was selected second overall in the NHL Amateur Draft, and he was also selected second overall in the WHA Amateur Draft, the same elite position in 2 different leagues in the same year, a distinction that very few players ever experience. Both leagues looked at the field of available talent and decided that only one prospect in the entire continent ranked ahead of him. The NHL club that called his name was the Colorado Rockies, a young, struggling franchise that had only recently relocated and was searching for a face to build around. Beck chose the NHL path, choosing the older, more established league over the WHA's promises. And here lies one of the quiet ironies of his career. He picked the big league, the prestige league, the one with the history. But the team he landed on sat in one of the quietest, least watched corners of professional hockey. Colorado was not a pressure cooker. It was not a media circus. It was, in many ways, the gentlest possible place for a young star to begin. That softness would turn out to matter enormously, because it gave Barry Beck a taste of the NHL with almost none of the burden. For now, though, all anyone wanted to know was whether the big kid from New Westminster could play at the highest level. What happened in his very first NHL season would rewrite the record books for rookie defensemen and hand him a taste of fame long before the pressure ever found him. Barry Beck did not ease into the National Hockey League. He exploded into it. In his rookie season with the Colorado Rockies, the young defenseman scored 22 goals. To put that in perspective, that was a higher total than he had ever managed in a single junior season, and he did it as a first-year player against the best in the world from the back end. Those 22 goals set what was, at the time, an NHL rookie record for goals by a defenseman. For a kid still learning the professional game, it was a staggering debut. And it wasn't just personal glory. That season, the Rockies reached the playoffs for the first time in franchise history, a milestone tied directly to the giant they drafted second overall. A struggling club, suddenly relevant, with a 21-year-old anchoring the blue line. The hockey world noticed. When the votes were counted for the Calder Memorial Trophy, the award for the league's top rookie, Beck finished as the runner-up. The only man ahead of him was Mike Bossy, the New York Islanders sniper who would go on to a Hall of Fame career as one of the greatest goal scorers the sport has ever seen. Losing the Calder to Bossy was no embarrassment. It was a sign that Beck had announced himself as one of the most promising young players in the entire league, By any reasonable read, this was the beginning of a superstar's arc. The size, the scoring, the toughness, the team success, it was all there. But the reason Colorado was so good for Barry Beck wasn't the wins or the records. It was something he would confess years later. Something about pressure, about parties, and about being 21 years old, with almost nobody watching. Years later, when Barry Beck looked back on his time in Colorado, he didn't talk about the goals or the records first. He talked about how easy it all felt. There wasn't any pressure on me, he admitted. For one thing, there was hardly any media coverage, and there weren't very many fans. For a young man in his early 20s, suddenly playing in the National Hockey League, that absence of scrutiny wasn't a problem. It was a gift. Nobody was dissecting his every shift. Nobody was writing columns about whether he was earning his draft position. He could just play and live and be young. And by his own account, he made the most of it. The first year was great, he recalled. We'd just party and have a good time. I think when you were 21, that is about as good as it can get. When we made the playoffs that year, it was even more exciting. It's a remarkably honest snapshot of a young athlete enjoying every bit of his arrival. A kid who had everything in front of him and nothing yet weighing him down. That's the part of the Colorado story that matters most. The freedom was the whole point. The quiet building, the empty seats, the indifferent press, all the things that would have frustrated an established star were exactly what allowed a 21-year-old to flourish without fear. But paradise has a way of ending. The second year in Colorado was not the first. His point totals dipped, the team slipped out of the playoff picture, and the easy magic of that rookie campaign proved hard to repeat. Frustrated and aware of how good that first season had been, Beck went to Rockies management and raised the idea of reworking his deal, pointing to everything he'd accomplished as a freshman. He was a young man trying to cash in on his own promise. What he didn't know was how soon and how dramatically his comfortable little world was about to be turned upside down. Then, just 10 games into his third season, the phone rang, and a single trade would drop a 21-year-old into the most demanding hockey market on Earth. On November 2nd, 1979, the quiet chapter of Barry Beck's career ended in a single phone call. The Colorado Rockies had traded their young cornerstone to the New York Rangers in a 5-piece blockbuster, and the price told you everything about how the hockey world valued him. To pry Beck loose, the Rangers gave up a small fortune in players. Heading to Colorado were Pat Hickey, Lucien Dubois, Mike McEwen, and Dean Turner, 4 established or promising names, along with future considerations. 4 players and more all surrendered to land one 21-year-old defenseman. In an era before the salary cap, before the trade machinery of modern hockey, this was the kind of deal that announced a franchise was going all in. Think about what that meant for the young man at the center of it. He'd been in the league barely 2 full seasons. He was only 10 games into his 3rd year. And he was being shipped not to just any team, but to an Original Six institution, one of the oldest, proudest, most scrutinized franchises in the sport, playing in the largest media market on the continent. When a team trades that many pieces to acquire one player, it isn't just making a roster move. It's making a promise to its fans. The Rangers were telling New York that they had found someone worth emptying the cupboard for, a savior on the blue line, a giant to build around. And a city that had been waiting decades for a Stanley Cup was more than ready to believe it. That's the cruel arithmetic of a blockbuster. The bigger the package, the bigger the expectation. The man who had thrived in anonymity in Colorado was about to inherit the full, crushing weight of New York's hopes, and he was still just 21 years old. And the story Beck himself told about why he was traded, it involved a coach's dog named Blue, a hockey stick, and a yelp, a tale so absurd it became legend. Every great hockey trade picks up its own folklore, and Barry Beck supplied his own with a grin. Years later, Beck loved to tell a story about how he ended up leaving Colorado. The Rockies at the time were coached by Don Cherry, the larger-than-life character who would later become one of the most famous voices in all of hockey. And Cherry, as anyone who knew him could tell you, was rarely far from his beloved bull terrier, Blue. As Beck told it, Blue wandered into the locker room one day and started rubbing against the floor near his stall. Beck, in his own telling, gave the dog a little whack with his stick. The dog went yelping straight back to Cherry's office, and the very next day, Beck was traded to New York. Now, let's be clear about what this is. It's a punchline, not an explanation. Beck told the story on himself, with obvious self-deprecating humor, and no one should mistake it for the actual reason a five-piece blockbuster came together. Trades of that magnitude are built on hockey logic, on team direction, on money and roster math, not on a dog with hurt feelings. But the anecdote is worth keeping for a different reason. It tells you who Barry Beck was as a man. Here was a player who could take the most disorienting moment of his young career, being uprooted from a city he loved and dropped into a pressure cooker, and turn it into a joke about a coach's dog. That's dry wit. That's self-awareness. That's a man able to laugh at how suddenly and strangely his comfortable life had been rearranged by forces entirely outside his control. Whatever the real reason, Beck arrived at Madison Square Garden and felt something he'd never felt in Colorado, and he scored in his very first game on Broadway. If Colorado had been a young man's paradise, New York was something else entirely, and Barry Beck felt the difference the moment he walked into Madison Square Garden. "This is what hockey is all about," he said of his arrival, playing in a historic arena like Madison Square Garden in a city like New York City. After 2 years in a half-empty building in a hockey backwater, the lights and noise and history of the Garden hit him like a jolt. This was the big time, the real thing, the stage every player imagines as a boy. And for a while, it looked like a perfect match. The start could hardly have been scripted better. In his very first game at the Garden, Beck scored. And against the Los Angeles Kings, no less, a club he'd cross paths with again much later in his story. A goal in his debut, in front of the most demanding fans in the sport. The crowd had its giant, and the giant delivered on cue. And it wasn't a one-night flash. In his first season wearing the Rangers blue, Beck put up 59 points in just 61 games, an outstanding pace for a defenseman, the kind of production that confirmed New York had landed exactly the player it thought it was getting. The scoring touch from Colorado had survived the move. The big man could clearly play on Broadway. But buried inside Beck's own excitement was a warning he may not have fully understood at the time. He grasped immediately what New York would demand of him, and he said it out loud. "You have to be consistently good every night as a player," he noted, instead of every other night. In Colorado, an off night vanished into the silence. In New York, there were no off nights, not for the man they'd traded the roster to get. The Rangers saw a leader. So in his second season, they handed him the most pressure-laden honor the franchise had to offer, the captaincy. And that's when his body began to betray him. The Rangers had paid a king's ransom for Barry Beck, and now they decided to make him their king. In 1980, his second season on Broadway, the club named him captain, handing the youngest of leaders the most pressure-laden symbol an original six franchise can offer. The official records would later list his captaincy across the early 1980s, succeeding the veteran Walt Takachuk, and years afterward, giving way to Ron Greschner. But the date on the page matters less than what the role actually meant. To wear the C for the New York Rangers is to carry something heavier than a hockey responsibility. It is to become the face of a city's hunger, a franchise that had gone decades without a championship, in a market that demanded one every single spring.
The fans, the writers, the talk radio crowd, all of it funneled through one man at the front of the dressing room. And that man was barely into his 20s, a kid who only a couple of years earlier had been happily anonymous in a half-empty rink in the mountains. He embraced it the way he embraced everything, head down, shoulders square, ready to absorb the hits. That season, he played 75 games, and here is the statistic that haunts the entire arc of his career. Those 75 games would stand forever as the most he ever played in a single season in a Rangers uniform. The high watermark came almost at the very beginning. Everything after would be a fight just to stay on the ice. Nobody knew that yet, of course. In the moment, it looked like the natural ascent of a franchise cornerstone. The big man, the scorer, the leader, settling into the role New York had built around him. The captaincy was supposed to be the start of a long reign. Instead, it turned out to be the peak. Because in the 1981-82 season, his shoulder separated for the first time, and the strongest part of his game began to crack. It started as the kind of injury hockey players shrug off. During the 1981-82 season, Barry Beck separated his shoulder. Painful, yes, but routine in a sport built on collisions. He would heal, he would return, and he would keep throwing his body around the way he always had. That was the plan, and for a man his size, it seemed reasonable enough. But the shoulder didn't heal cleanly into the past. It became a recurring nightmare. The trouble returned the following year, nagging and limiting and refusing to fully go away. By 1984, the damage was serious enough to require surgery, a real operation on the joint that had always been his foundation. For a defenseman whose entire identity was force, that was no small thing. And the toll showed up where it hurts a franchise most, in availability. The fortress simply couldn't stay standing. In the 1985-86 season, Beck was limited to just 25 games. Wrap that against the 75 he'd played in his captaincy year, and the collapse is stark. A man who had been a 60-game every-night presence was now watching from the sidelines more often than he was patrolling the blue line. There's a cruel irony at the heart of this. Everything about Beck's game was built on strength, on leverage, on contact, on the power to move men off the puck and punish anyone who came through his area. And the shoulder is exactly where that strength lives. The injury didn't just sideline him, it attacked the very thing that made him who he was. You can play through a lot of pain in hockey. It's much harder to play through the erosion of your one great gift. A city that had emptied its roster to get him now watched its giant flicker in and out of the lineup, never quite the immovable object they'd been promised. And as his body faded, so did his scoring, and a frustrated phrase about Barry Beck would echo through the Garden for decades. For all his size and all his early scoring, the numbers told a quiet, uncomfortable story as the years went on. When Beck did make it into the lineup, his offensive output never climbed back to where it had been. Not the 22-goal rookie magic of Colorado, not the 59 points of that dazzling first season on Broadway. The production sagged, and in a market like New York, a sagging stat line on a player they'd paid so dearly for does not go unnoticed. It became part of the public narrative around him, the sense that this enormous, gifted defenseman was somehow holding back, leaving something on the table every night. Fair or not, that perception stuck, and it eventually crystallized into 4 words that Rangers fans still repeat to this day. Shoot the puck, Barry. The phrase is tied to the longtime Rangers broadcaster Bill Chadwick, a familiar voice to the Garden faithful, and over time, it grew into a genuine piece of franchise folklore, a bit of exasperated affection aimed at a captain his own city wanted to see do more. It wasn't cruelty. It was the sound of a fan base that believed in Beck's talent, perhaps more than his battered body could deliver on, urging him to unleash the cannon they knew he had. But think about what that means psychologically for the man wearing the C. Here was a captain whose own city, through the very broadcaster narrating his games, was openly, repeatedly telling him he wasn't doing enough. Every time the crowd murmured those words, it was a reminder of the gap between the giant they'd traded for and the hobbled veteran fighting his own shoulder just to dress. He was a marked man in his own building, carrying a phrase that followed him like a shadow. The pressure, the injuries, and a new coach Beck couldn't stand all collided in 1986, and the captain did the unthinkable. He walked away. By the end of the 1985-86 season, Barry Beck had reached a breaking point. He'd played just 25 games, his shoulder was a wreck, and the relationship between the captain and his head coach, Ted Sator, had curdled into something neither man could repair. So Beck did what almost no one expected a franchise leader to do. He walked away from the New York Rangers. The reason he gave, through his agent, was carefully chosen. There are philosophical differences between Coach Ted Sator and myself, the statement read. And then the crucial qualifier. This does not necessarily mean I'm retiring, but at present, I don't want to play hockey in the upcoming season. It wasn't a retirement. It wasn't even a clean break. It was a captain refusing to report, a man planting his flag against his own coach and daring the organization to choose. What's important to understand is that Beck was not some lone malcontent. Ted Sator's tenure behind the Rangers bench was marked by friction across the room. He clashed with Mark Pavelich, he clashed with Reijo Ruotsalainen, he clashed with Pierre LaRouche and with Walt Podubny, a roster's worth of talented players who found themselves at odds with the coach's approach. Seen in that light, Beck's exit wasn't an isolated tantrum. It looked far more like the most visible casualty of a genuine locker room revolt, with the captain leading the way out the door. That's the thing about the C in a market like New York. When the leader walks, it isn't just one player sitting out. It's a statement about the entire direction of the team, a public referendum on the man behind the bench. Beck had carried the city's pressure for years. Now, broken down and fed up, he was using whatever leverage he had left to make a point that everyone in hockey would hear. When the Rangers fired Sator that November and begged their captain to come back, Beck's answer revealed everything about how broken the relationship truly was. For a while, it looked like Barry Beck had won. On November 21st, 1986, General Manager Phil Esposito fired Ted Sator, the very coach Beck had walked out over. The friction that had emptied a captain's chair and rankled half a dressing room was suddenly gone. The obstacle had been removed, and Esposito, eager to repair his roster, personally reached out and invited Beck to come back. This was the moment, on paper, where the prodigal captain returns in triumph. The coach he couldn't stand was out. The door was wide open. All Beck had to do was walk back through it. He didn't. Instead, Beck delivered an answer so measured, so guarded, that it told you everything about the state of the man. Esposito's move, he said, does nothing to change my decision to sit out this season. And then came the line that captured his strange limbo perfectly. As I have said before, Beck noted, I continue to leave the door open for a possible return to the team. Read those words carefully.
because there's a whole psychology buried inside them. The thing he publicly cited as his reason for leaving was now gone, and still he wouldn't come back. That tells you the rift went far deeper than one coach.
This was a man worn down to the bone, a battered shoulder, years of carrying a relentless market, the constant murmur that he wasn't giving enough. Removing solder didn't fix any of that. So Beck froze. He wouldn't fully retire, and he wouldn't fully return. He hovered in the in-between, a captain without a team, unwilling to close a chapter he could no longer bear to live inside. It's the posture of someone too proud to quit and too hurt to commit. A man stuck between his own stubbornness and his own pain, leaving a door cracked just wide enough to keep his options alive. A year and a half later, that door swung open. Beck returned for training camp in 1987, and in a single preseason hit, he heard a noise that ended everything. Time and a long stretch away from the collisions can heal a lot. After roughly a year and a half on the sidelines, letting his ravaged shoulder settle and rebuild, Barry Beck decided he was ready to play again. He came back to the Rangers for training camp ahead of the 1987-88 season, the Giant returning to claim the role he'd abandoned, the door he'd left open, finally swinging wide. It should have been the start of a redemption story. It lasted only until a preseason game against the Winnipeg Jets. Beck took a hit in the corner. Ordinary contact, the kind of routine board battle he'd won 10,000 times. But this time, his body answered differently. "I felt it pop right away," he said. "I heard noise." That's the kind of sentence that makes anyone who has played the game wince. Not pain first, but sound. The audible failure of the joint that had carried his entire identity as a player. At the hospital, the worst was confirmed. Damage to the tissue and the ligaments around the shoulder. And just like that, the comeback was over before it had truly begun. At the age of 30, Beck announced his retirement, and the words he chose carried a kind of stoic clarity that lingers. "The strength of my game is strength," he said. "This latest injury would have taken that away from me. And that's the only way I know how to play." Sit with that for a moment, because it's the whole tragedy distilled into 3 sentences. Beck understood himself perfectly. He was never a finesse player dancing around checks. He was force, leverage, contact, power. Take that away, and you weren't left with a different kind of player. You were left with a man trying to do a job with the one tool he relied on snapped in half. He wasn't willing to be a diminished version of himself, and he was honest enough to say so out loud. Most men would have stopped there, with a graceful and final goodbye. But 3 years later, at 32, Beck made one last desperate run at the league, this time chasing a championship beside Wayne Gretzky. By August of 1989, the shoulder had finally fully healed, and the old hunger came roaring back. At 32, after 3 years away from the pro game, Barry Beck decided he wanted back in. But not in New York. He wanted to be closer to his Vancouver home, out west, away from the city that had asked so much of him. The Los Angeles Kings were happy to oblige. On September 1st, 1989, they sent a 4th-round draft pick to the Rangers to acquire his rights, and Beck signed on for a single season. The carrot was irresistible. The Kings were now the Wayne Gretzky Kings, freshly built around the greatest player the sport had ever seen, suddenly one of the most glamorous tickets in hockey. For a veteran who'd never won it all, the idea of one last shift beside the great one was the stuff of dreams. The reality was harder. Beck struggled to find a foothold, shuffled in and out of the lineup, used sparingly as the season wore on. The man who'd signed him,
Kings general manager Roger Vachon offered a blunt explanation. Beck, he felt, simply lacked the foot speed for the up-tempo Smythe division. He has been frustrated going in and out of the lineup, Vachon said.
Because he may not have had the speed, he compensated by playing conservatively. Beck did not take that lying down. There was still fire in him, still pride. They told me I couldn't handle it, he shot back. If that's what they're thinking, maybe they've got to go with it. I didn't think I was all that bad. It's a small, defiant moment. A former star refusing to accept the verdict that the league had finally outrun him. But the numbers and the minutes told their own story. On March 7th, 1990, with the season winding down, Beck announced his retirement once more, and this time, it stuck. The last shift had come and gone. The Stanley Cup he'd chased to Los Angeles would belong to someone else. And then a player who had once carried all of New York simply vanished from the league entirely, only to resurface years later on the other side of the planet, in a place no hockey fan would ever expect. Long after the cheering stopped, the institution he'd given his best years to offered a quiet measure of his place in its history. In the 2009 book, 100 Ranger Greats, the authors ranked Barry Beck 62nd all-time among the 901 players who had worn the jersey across the franchise's first 82 seasons. 62nd out of 901. Not a banner in the rafters, not a Hall of Fame plaque, but a real, durable acknowledgement that even with everything that went wrong, he mattered to one of hockey's proudest clubs. Then came the third act almost no one saw coming. Beck didn't drift into the usual retired player orbit of broadcasting booths or alumni dinners back home. He relocated to Hong Kong, about as far from Madison Square Garden as a hockey life can take you. There, he became head coach of the Hong Kong men's national ice hockey team. And as of 2013, he was serving as general manager and coach of the Hong Kong Academy of Ice Hockey, teaching the game in a corner of the world where the ice was scarce and the history was still being written. There's something fitting about that. The man who'd been packaged and traded and scrutinized since he was a teenager, who'd carried the weight of an original Six City until his own body gave out, found a place where the game could just be the game again. No relentless press, no forward chants, no king's ransom hanging over his head. Just hockey, and kids learning it from a giant who'd seen the very top. And so we return to the question we started with. Was Barry Beck undone by his shoulder or by something heavier? The honest answer is that the two can't really be separated. Strength was his identity. It's the word he himself reached for when he explained why he had to stop. And it was strength, in the most literal sense, that betrayed him, joint by joint, hit by hit. But you can't ignore the rest of it. The blockbuster that made him a savior before he was ready. The captaincy at an age when most players are still finding their footing. The constant demand to be great every single night in a market that forgave nothing. Maybe the shoulder was simply the part that broke first. He arrived with everything: the size, the scoring, the pedigree, the promise of 15 brilliant years. He left early, twice. A giant who carried a demanding city until he could carry it no more, and then walked quietly off to teach the game half a world away. The body failed him in the end. But you're left to wonder whether the real opponent, the one he could never quite beat, was the weight New York placed on his shoulders long before they ever gave out.